Good afternoon and welcome to the Leading Voices lecture series. My name, as some of you know, is Charlie Whelan. I teach the companion course at the Rockefeller Center in which many of our speakers, after or before they've given their public lecture, come and speak to the students for a more in-depth discussion. If you have been coming to the lecture series regularly over the summer, you're not mildly depressed by some of the things that have come up, namely our fiscal situation and healthcare, then you're either very optimistic or you've been sleeping through some of the lectures. In addition to sobering news about these issues, however, one of the things we have tried to do is bring people through who are working actively to address these challenges. So we had Secretary Geithner talk about the deficit. We had President Kim talk about things that Dartmouth's doing on the healthcare front. And now we also have some presidential candidates who, if elected, would be addressing all of these challenges at once. On Thursday, as a forward promote, just addressing one of the challenges, we will have Joel Klein, former Chancellor of the New York City Public Schools, who will be talking at noon. So our presidential candidates are coming through. We have the luxury today of hosting Republican candidate Jon Huntsman. I come from Chicago, where when it comes to politics, we often describe our politicians as not being an Eagle Scout. Today is the first time I can say he is an Eagle Scout in the literal sense of that phrase. He's got many other qualifications as well. Mr. Huntsman was elected governor of Utah in 2008. During his tenure as governor, Utah became the fastest growing state in the nation. It was named the best state for business by Forbes, the best managed state by Pew, and the state with the best tax policy by the Cato Institute. Governor Huntsman was reelected in 2009 before resigning to serve as U.S. ambassador to China. His service in China was the culmination of many years spent on international issues. Huntsman served as U.S. ambassador to Singapore from 1992 to 93. He was a deputy U.S. trade representative under George W. Bush, where he worked on the global trade talks at Doha as part of that round of the WTO. He was also involved in the accession of China and Taiwan into the World Trade Organization. And most recently, as I mentioned, he was the U.S. ambassador to China. Ambassador Huntsman will be speaking today about America's international challenges, particularly the U.S.-China relationship. We're also pleased to have his daughter Liddy with us here in the audience today. With that, please welcome Jon Huntsman, Republican candidate for President of the United States.
What a good man. I appreciate that intro. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Charlie, thanks for that great introduction. I'm honored and delighted to be here as a candidate for the presidency of the United States of America. And as I look over this crowd at Dartmouth College, I know exactly what you're thinking. You're looking at me and you're saying, well, he looks pretty normal to me. Why would he be doing a crazy thing like this? And all I can say is we all have that side of our brain that is the cautious side. Why would a father of 7, somebody with a relatively decent track record in public service, want a target on his back constantly by running for president of the United States? And then we all have that patriotic side of our brain that takes over. And it says, you love this country. It's the greatest country that ever was. And we're facing some historic challenges. And we all have a choice. You all have a choice. Because the 2012 election is going to be about your generation, you students who are here. Either we get it right in 2012, or you move forward by kicking the can down the road and you have a lost decade like they have in Japan. So I would argue that 2012 is critically important for all of you, and we all have a role to play. Some are going to be candidates. Others need to be activists getting out and involved in the campaign. And I'm calling on you and asking for you to get involved. It's great to be in Hanover the second time. The first time was when we were just newly arrived from China. We came here, our first time politicking in New Hampshire. We stopped off at Jesse's restaurant down the street. Now, if you've never run for president before, how you do it here in New Hampshire is pretty extraordinary. They just take kind of a run-of-the-mill candidate, drop him or her into Jesse's restaurant or a town hall meeting or a house party, and 30 members, 40 members of the media crowd around you immediately. People rush you with questions, and all of a sudden it's pretty apparent to somebody who's been living in Beijing for the last couple of years that this is politics American style. We are wide open. We are transparent. We do it the old-fashioned way. We expect answers. We expect people to step up and actually have a vision for where they want to take this country. So I'm mighty grateful for that first visit here to Hanover, and now it's number 2. And I'm reminded of a little bit of repartee between Sir Winston Churchill and George Bernard Shaw that took place back in the 1950s when the Prime Minister wasn't so popular. George Bernard Shaw, the great playwright, was in London opening the play Pygmalion. Remember that? Later known as My Fair Lady. And he wrote a letter to Winston Churchill, basically saying, "Dear Prime Minister, enclosed, please find 2 tickets for the opening night of my play. One for you and one for a friend, if you have one." Yes, he was unpopular at the time, but he still had enough thought to put pen to paper and write back to George Bernard Shaw, in which he wrote, "Dear Mr. Shaw, due to the press of business, I cannot attend the first show, but would be delighted to attend the second show, if there is one." I feel in a sense that we have a second show right here at Dartmouth College, and I am very, very grateful. My daughter Elizabeth is right back here. If you have any questions that I can't answer, she's a recent college graduate. I'm sure she'd be delighted to fill in the gaps. We've got a lot of other friends from our campaign here as well. We're going to talk about China, mostly during the question and answer period, and I look forward to that. But I want to tell you that the best approach to strengthening the U.S.-China relationship is getting it right here at home. And we are broken here at home. It is getting our core rebuilt on the home front because we have lost our leverage in many of our international relationships, China among them. So when you negotiate with China and you sit at the table and you feel that because our core is weak and our economy is flat, that China takes advantage of that? Of course they do. The best approach to dealing with China longer term is getting our house in order, is strengthening our core. A lot of people say, well, why would you do this? Why would you run for president of the United States? What drives you in this direction? It's pretty simple. I'm driven to run for president of this great country because I can't stand the thought that we're about ready to hand down the greatest nation that ever was to your generation, less good, less competitive, saddled with debt, less hopeful than the country we got. I was born in 1960. We exported $3 for every $2 we imported. We controlled 36% of the world's GDP. Science, technology, Nobel Prize winners, they all resided here. And I stopped to ponder the world that this next generation is getting. And I say, this is un-American, and it's a completely unnatural place for us to be in. For the first time in history, handing down a country that is less good than the one we got. And we all ought to be waking up every morning to do something about it. I worked for President Reagan many years ago. He talked about that shining city on a hill, the old John Winthrop description. I know a lot of people in this country today feel that that light is dimmed, that we don't project that goodness, that majesty that we once did. A lot of people feel that the American dream is beyond their ability to capture it anymore. Sad times. We can do better and we must do better. And here we sit with unemployment 9.2%. You look at 2020, the year 2020, if you just extrapolate current earnings, after Medicare, after Social Security, after interest payments on the debt, there's nothing left. So what do you do about national security? What do you do about things like disaster relief? That's the world you're getting, your generation, unless we stop in this election cycle, 2012, to do something about it. So the president's a good man, he's got a good family, he's earnest, but he's fundamentally failed us on the most important issue of our time, which is job creation and the economy. Well, so Mr. Governor, what are you going to do? Well, let me tell you this to start with. I've been walking the streets of China for the last 2 years. I've lived in Asia 4 times. So I've seen the rise of Asia starting in the late 1970s and most recently in that powerhouse country, China, the last 2 years. I've tried to crack the code on China for a lot of years. Language study, politics, economics, commerce. And all I can say is you walk the streets of Beijing, you walk the streets of Shanghai, you walk the streets of Guangzhou, and there's energy. People are excited about where they are in life. All blue sky. 8, 9, 10% economic growth for 30 years running. And you reflect on this country from 10,000 miles away. And all I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is we are in a funk, this country. It is unnatural and it is unhealthy for us to be this down and out and dejected. And we're not going to get out of this funk we're in until we deal realistically with debt and spending. And we're not going to be realistic about debt and spending until we get a balanced budget amendment passed in this country. It is immoral, the idea that we are squandering the wealth of this generation, and we ought to make it unconstitutional as well. Every state has to deal with a balanced budget amendment. As governor, I had to deal with one, and it is the greatest safeguard in the world against the run-up in spending. This nation needs the same thing. And number two, we're not going to get serious about debt and spending until we are brave and courageous enough to tackle it head on. No sacred cows. That's entitlements on the table. That's the Department of Defense on the table. The minute we start saying there's a sacred cow in the mix, you can't be intellectually honest about the work that needs to be done. Now, there are a lot of reports and studies that have been done, congressional reports, the Budget Review Committee. Ideas are out there. We just need a little bit of leadership coupled with those plans. Number two, we need to expand this economy and create jobs. We don't make things in this country anymore. When I was born in 1960, our manufacturing base as a percentage of GDP was well into the 20s. Today we're sitting at 11%. We need companies. I mean, my daughter loves Lady Gaga, and that's great. But we need companies that export products. We need companies that hire people and create jobs. We need to make sure that when we read that Made in America label, that it actually means something, not only to us, but to the rest of the world. And how do we get to that position? I think three things are going to be critically important to ignite the economic engines that are going to mean something longer term in this country. One, we need serious tax reform, like we did in a state, when we got our state moving into the #1 position in terms of job creation in the entire country. You can't be competitive, you can't attract brain power, you can't coalesce capital effectively and deploy it into the marketplace with the second highest business tax in the developed world. It's just not going to happen. We need tax reform. Two, we need to get the regulatory monkey off our back in this country. Whether it's healthcare reform and the unpredictable nature of where healthcare costs are going into the future, whether it is EPA and manufacturing, whether it is Dodd-Frank and the uncertainty in the financial marketplace, we need serious regulatory reform in this country because today there's no confidence in our future. There's no ability to see around the corner in terms of what the future brings. And it's therefore no surprise that we have capital in the marketplace, but no one's deploying it. We've got the industries of tomorrow that are in the pipeline in Silicon Valley, personalized medicine, biotechnology, new and creative ways of powering our future. But they're not going out to the marketplace because there's no confidence. Three, the lowest of low-hanging fruit that I think would be an immediate engine of growth in this country, energy independence. We've talked about it for 8 presidents. And yet today here we sit on an abundance of resources. If somebody told you today that the United States had as much natural gas as Saudi Arabia has crude oil, that'd be the story of the century. And that's reality. And yet we don't pay any attention to it. It's almost like it doesn't exist. Everyone wants to draw from the sun and everybody wants to draw from the wind, and I do too. And we tried to make that happen in the state of Utah, but we need more time. We need a transitional product for transportation, for power, for manufacturing that will get us from where we are today into the future. Natural gas. It's cheap, it's clean, it's ours, and it carries profound national security implications in a part of the world that is dangerous and unpredictable. Fourth and finally, let me just say, We need to be a little more skeptical in this country of foreign entanglements. Now, the old view of the world by George Kennan, 1946, when he wrote that great article on containment, signed X in Foreign Affairs magazine. Those days are gone. We need to redefine our core national security interests, and we need to make sure our friends and our allies know that they're friends and allies in the world. I think today it's a little murky. I look at Libya, there's no defined goal, there's no defined national security interest, there's no exit strategy, and I say, why do we want to be involved? I look at Afghanistan. We fought the good war for 10 years, this country. Families have given their all, communities have given their all. We've rallied around our troops like never before. We had free elections in 2004. Karzai's in power, say whatever you want about him. The Taliban was uprooted, and we've dismantled and upended Al-Qaeda. And they're now in sanctuaries in western Pakistan, Waziristan. It's time for us to come home. It's time for us to recognize the reality of what we're up against in Afghanistan. It isn't a nation-building exercise, it's counter-terror. And in order to deal with that reality, you don't need 100,000 boots on the ground and the expenses that carries. You need intelligence gathering capability, you need a special forces presence, and you need something to help train the Afghan national troops all the while. The world we live in today is not the containment world. It is an asymmetric world. It is a world that's going to require us to rethink about our strategy, our approaches, and where we are positioned in the world. And then some people say, well, gee, Mr. Governor, that's an interesting thought. If you pull from Afghanistan to that extent, what about Pakistan? I'm here to tell you, we can't do a damn thing about Pakistan. Only Pakistan can save Pakistan. Only Afghanistan can save Afghanistan. We can't wish for stability in a nation state more than they do. As for me, right now, I'm more concerned about America helping America. Because if we don't have that core of strength and economic might, we're of no value to the rest of the world. Finally, let me just say, 2012 is going to be important. Go look at all the candidates. I hope you look at our candidacy too. I hope you go on our website, Jon 2012. I hope you look at what we've done. I'm running on my record. Not everybody's going to like 100% of it. They never do. But I'm running on my record. A lot of people run from their record. So when you look at our record, you'll see that we've got the #1 job-creating state back when I was governor, as compared and contrasted with others in the race who will want to roll out their numbers. This 2012 cycle is going to be about getting on our feet economically, and it's going to be about job creation. Make no mistake about it. But I also believe that it will be highlighted by perhaps the most important long-term undertaking of all, and that is whether or not the United States of America is prepared to meet the competitiveness challenges of the 21st century. That isn't a war in Afghanistan. That isn't involvement in Libya. That will be an economic set of engagements across the Pacific Ocean that will determine our standard of living, the value of our currency, and how well this next generation does. And I'm here to tell you, we need to prepare for that battle like never before. Thank you all very much for having me here. It's an honor and a privilege. Great, thank you. Let me just use this.
Sure. I'm mic'd up here. Thank you very much for coming. One of the conventions of this series is the last speaker, who happened to be Buddy Roemer, a fellow Republican candidate for president, gets to ask the first question for the next speaker. We'll give you that prerogative at the end. Governor Buddy Roemer's question was about trade with China. And in particular, is it free, is it fair, and is it good for both countries?
I would say it's evolving and will be evolving for some time. I look at our trading relationship. You know, we're going on 40 years of the U.S.-China relationship. When you go back to the summer of 1971, when Henry Kissinger made his secret trip into Beijing and laid the foundation for President Nixon's visit in February of 1972, Nixon arrived at Shoudu Jiqiang, Beijing Capital Airport, stepped off at 7:07, shook the hand of Zhou Enlai, and I'd have to tell you that was probably the handshake that changed the world for the following decades. Our trade then was zero. And I look back on my predecessor in China, many times removed, George H.W. Bush, and he wrote in his memoirs lamenting the fact that U.S.-China trade was $500 million strong, 1975, 500 million. Today we're at 400 billion, soon to be the largest trading relationship the world has ever known. It will surpass our trading relationship with Canada. China has a very distinct advantage, and they use some of those advantages against us. One is a discounted currency. The other is selective enforcement of their trade obligations. Another clearly would be showing preferences on the purchasing and the procurement side of trade, showing advantages to local entrepreneurs or local party members. And an additional challenge, I would say, is their very lax enforcement of intellectual property rights, where we develop strong ideas, strong technology, we transfer technology and it disappears. These are all huge challenges in the U.S.-China trading relationship. So is it fair? No, it's not fair yet, because we still have a lot of hurdles to overcome. Has it been good for China? Of course. They've created the largest export platform ever known in the history of humankind in southern China. And many of you have been there. You know, I certainly have bounced around there for a whole lot of years. And they've benefited from the income derived from the largest, most aggressive export machine ever assembled. But that dynamic is changing, it's interesting to note. And it's going to go from a country that has traditionally based its economic performance off exports to one that now is going to be importing more, because they're transitioning from an export model to a consumption-based model. And it means increasingly they're going to have to take their currency, which is now 17% discounted in the marketplace, and they're going to have to move it closer to a market-based reality. What does that do for us? It means, at least in theory, that our exports ought to be clipping along at a rate better than before. So I would tell you that in the years to come, the next, say, 2 to 5 years, the two most pronounced trends in the U.S.-China commercial and economic relationship will be more in the way of export opportunities for U.S. businesses, small businesses particularly, to get their products into China at a more economically competitive rate. And again, a lot of that's going to depend on how good we are at continuing the market opening measures in China. And two, Chinese investment coming in this direction. The United States is still the preferred market for China in terms of where they want to invest a lot of their foreign exchange. You can look around the map and you can see what markets are available and the relative risk associated with each market. The United States still tops the list. For all of our challenges and difficulties, this is where China would like to be. Although they're very concerned about repeating the mistakes that Japan made 25 and 30 years ago. Trophy investments, and then being criticized for those trophy investments. You remember when Japan came in 25, 30 years ago, bought the Chrysler building, bought a good part of Hollywood, bought Pebble Beach, and then were roundly criticized for their trophy investments. China remembers that chapter of economic history very well. And they want to make sure that their investment here doesn't fall victim to a sense that it is unwelcome. Investment here from any destination is good. It expands our economic base and it creates jobs. So those are the two, I think, most pronounced trends that you're going to see over the next several years. And I'm guessing that with more years of a balanced relationship driven by a more market-based currency, more in the way of market opening measures in China, we're going to see that deficit come down, like it did in Taiwan. Remember when we ran, I've lived in Taiwan twice over the years, we ran huge deficits with Taiwan, as we did with Korea as well. Although China is a much larger market and it's going to take a lot more work and a longer period of time in order for us to get there.
So part of the imbalances that we've run so far is that China's loaned us an awful lot of money. One of their favorite investments is treasury bonds. They are, if not our largest, one of our largest creditors outside the United States. If you were still in Beijing, what would you tell our largest external creditor about what is happening or not happening in Washington right now?
You're getting me in deep trouble by asking that one.
It's my goal.
First of all, I think we all have to admit that, we dug the hole here. People criticize China for investing in debt instruments and treasuries. We dug the hole. Somebody's going to have to buy our debt, and China is there at about $950 billion. and maybe $300 billion additional in other investments, Freddie and Fannie. Japan, interestingly enough, is right on their heels, probably at $900 billion, $850, $900 billion. So if you look at the tally of those invested in our treasuries and debt, China leads the pack, but not by much. They want us to succeed. They want us to move forward in a way that speaks to market stability and predictability. And any message to the Chinese right now would have to be about our Congress works in ways that the National People's Congress doesn't in Beijing. The National People's Congress in China isn't open. It isn't transparent. They don't do news conferences. They don't release information from their backroom negotiations. In our system, everything is released. Everything is tweeted the moment that there is an apparent deal in the works. That's just our system. It works for us. And it's who we are, and it's what fuels our democracy. And I would tell them that we know that you don't understand our system in many parts of China's government. They criticize our system, but it's the way we function. And you're going to hear the debates back and forth. That's the way we get business done. It's very, very dissimilar to what is done in the Great Hall of the People with the National People's Congress. They need to understand that. But the end point is what we all hope for, and that's greater stability in our domestic finances, which will translate into greater stability in the international finance marketplace as well.
If you look at the U.S.-China relationship beyond the trade relationship, could you broadly speak about two different sets of issues, those issues for which our interests are broadly aligned? So if I were to guess, I'd say non-proliferation, North Korea, where working together with China, we can see a common goal. And other interests where they may not be aligned, so energy, scarce resources, the South China Sea, and talk about those two different sets of issues and how you would resolve both of them.
The U.S.-China relationship is complex, and it's growing more complex with each passing year, highlighted most recently by the fact that both countries are now on the world stage like never before. So China's on the world stage where they weren't in earlier years. They didn't anticipate being on the world stage this early, but because of the economic implosion worldwide and some other externalities, they've risen to the world stage far earlier than they would have thought. Their challenge on the world stage is how to lead, because China doesn't traditionally want to play that role. They don't want to be a leader in the world. But the spotlight is on, they're on the world stage, and people expect them to take a leadership position, and they're very reluctant to do so. And occasionally they will seem to be in fumble formation because they are not out on some of the shared interests that you talked about, as they should be, whether it's peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, whether it's proliferation, weaponization in Iran, whether it's international economic rebalancing. But I think that dynamic will change in the next several years. China will learn how to survive on the world stage while leading out on certain issues that can tie right back to their own core interests, because they won't care about the others that are not directly related to their core interests. What needs to happen in the U.S.-China relationship for us to not only get a better understanding of our shared interests, but also a clearer definition of the interests around which we don't necessarily converge, we need a long-term strategic dialogue with China, which we've never been able to work out in any kind of successful way. And that's in large part because Chinese leaders are traditionally the best long-term strategic thinkers in the world. We, on the other hand, are the best short-term tactical thinkers in the world. And bridging those two cultures is a very difficult thing to do. We sit down and have negotiations with China, and it typically is about the immediate, the here and now. We need this market opened. We need your currency changed by this amount, and we want it this quarter. We want it before Congress meets next time. And they sit back and say, well, we can't process that. We don't think that way. We want to know where you, the United States, where you're going to be 10 years from now and 20 years from now. So we need to figure out a way to better engage China in a long-term strategic dialogue that allows us to be frank, that allows us to be very open, particularly about our differences, and for there to be no sunlight around those issues that are highly sensitive, and many of them you talked about, issues like Taiwan, issues like the South China Sea, issues like Tibet, issues like their treatment of some of their minorities, issues around human rights. These are all issues that we feel very, very strongly about in this country. They're oftentimes not understood, at least on the Chinese side, in terms of why we're pushing them, why we feel the way we do, and that needs to be brought into proper context in some longer-term dialogue. And similarly, we need to hear from them. This in a world where our militaries are not talking and haven't for years. You can imagine the distrust and the finger-pointing that emerges in two different military silos, one in the United States and one in China, when you're not talking. You need to let a little pressure out of the valve from time to time. That needs to happen as part of a long-term strategic dialogue. But both countries, I believe, would be better served by somehow forging, driven by the President of the United States, because let's face it, the U.S.-China relationship traditionally has been driven by the executive branch, because it is driven on the Chinese side by the head of state. You can't subordinate it to some other level and expect it to really have the discussions that are so critically important longer term. It's got to be handled at the head of state relationship. So a long-term strategic dialogue that is able to capture, one, our shared interests, and they are many, and two, the issues over which we find differences, and to make sure that they understand in very clear terms why we feel the way we do.
Terrific. We will now turn to the audience. There are microphones. I will start with the students here. So let's go right here in the front.
Hi, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
I was wondering, what is at stake if the relationship between U.S. and China changes for the better or the worse?
If it changes for the worse, it has an immediate impact on the markets. And the markets have an immediate impact on our ability to create jobs and deliver in this country a higher standard of living, because China is such a major economic partner of ours. So you take the largest economy in the world and the second largest economy in the world, one $15 trillion, the other's $5 trillion in GDP. That's the U.S. and China. So you find things deteriorating. The first impact is on market stability and trust and confidence in the markets. And that hits every family, and that hits every business, and that hits the value of our currency, and has other economic implications that are negative. The other side, of course, is that if we can figure out how to forge a long-term positive relationship, understanding full well that there'll be a lot of issues about which we're going to disagree. And we need to be open and upfront and very blunt about what those disagreements are. If we can manage the kind of relationship we just described, where you're having those hard discussions and all the while building trust and confidence because you're talking and you're willing to put those issues on the table, then I think that results in just the opposite. And that results in a marketplace that has greater trust, a marketplace that is expanding by way of economic and trade links, and a marketplace that ultimately is able to deliver a higher quality of life, standard of living, and jobs when we need it most. And that, to me, is I think, the most important outcome that we should all hope for and work toward in the U.S.-China relationship. Because throughout your lifetime and beyond, this is the relationship that will matter most. There isn't another relationship, as far as you can see into the 21st century, that is as profoundly consequential economically and from a security standpoint as the U.S.-China relationship. So we've got to make it work.
So right over here on the end.
Hi, thank you very much for coming today. I just want to get your opinion on what is the proper balance in between pursuing economic mutual interest and the human rights issues that we also care a lot about.
They both must be part of the relationship. Sometimes human rights falls victim to economic interests, and I think that's a mistake. We've had a relationship with China for 40 years now. I mean, it described Nixon getting off the plane in February of 1972, almost 40 years ago, this next February. Over 40 years, we built a bilateral relationship that is based mostly on shared interests, trade, investment, people-to-people stuff, transactional. We need to infuse the relationship going forward more with shared values, if you know what I mean. So when we wake up in 20 years, we would see a U.S.-China relationship that maintained our shared interests in economics and trade and improving our respective qualities of life, but you would also find a U.S.-China relationship that had shared values that were infused into what today is pretty much only shared interests. And when I say shared values, I'm talking about human rights. I'm talking about the role and importance of the internet in society. I'm talking about political reform, those things that are very, very difficult to discuss. If we can't infuse exactly what you described, human rights, into our economic relationship and do it in a way that's balanced so that they're not kind of mutually exclusive, then we lose the glue, the cement that should hold this relationship together longer term. I mean, why is it that some relationships we have work and others don't? The relationships that work generally have a combination of shared interests and shared values. If you have a relationship that is devoid of shared values, you lose that glue longer term that really cements people together, and in governments and in government to government, and NGOs and NGOs, and that's what needs to happen.
Oh, actually, we're going to stick with just one question per person per time. Right here. So.
Thank you, Ambassador Huntsman. So I was curious as to what you think the role of international governmental organizations and like an international legal framework will play in the U.S.-China relationship, as well as just, as you were mentioning earlier, the U.S. role in the international community as a whole, and whether you feel like the State Department is doing enough to really engage these avenues, or whether it should perhaps take more of a one-on-one approach, as you were mentioning with China.
You've got to find the right balance in bilateral versus multilateral approaches with China. The challenge today, as it has been traditionally, is China wants to work in multilateral fora. They'll commit troops, but only through UN peacekeeping operations. They never do what other countries do, just sort of unilaterally to a hotspot in the world. They won't do much with North Korea or Iran in the way of sanctions in a unilateral or even a bilateral way, unless it has cover multilaterally. So there are those aspects of the U.S.-China relationship that have to be part of motivating China and getting them to move. And I do believe that this is part of their transition from being kind of seen as a member of the broader global community to one where now they're on the world stage and the world is looking to them to lead on many of these key issues. And I think in the years to come, it will be apparent to China that you can't work always in a multilateral context. You got to work occasionally unilaterally or bilaterally. And I do believe that our relationship will evolve more from where it has been, where a lot of the work has been done kind of under the cover of multilateral organizations, to one where I think our bilateral relationship will be more effective when China understands the stakes, they understand what it means to be on the world stage, they understand the importance of only 2 or 3 countries of the world that actually can problem solve around some of these very intractable issues. And I think then you'll find that the relationship is based more on bilateral interaction as opposed to finding cover all the time through multilateral efforts.
And right on the aisle there.
Thank you, Mr. Huntsman, for coming to New Hampshire, and welcome back.
Thank you.
You are something of an anomaly in the Republican field in that you are only one of 2 candidates who acknowledge the importance and role of climate change and man's significant impact on the climate. And yet your proposed solutions seem to suggest, for example, natural gas, which has been shown in recent Cornell studies to have a carbon footprint at least as large as coal. Given that projections are that the climate's going to warm anywhere between 3 and 6 degrees by the end of the century with a business as usual approach, and given also that we both agree that we are not ready to move to renewables right away, What will you do to move us away from a business as usual approach as quickly as possible?
First of all, I think that science should lead this discussion, not politics, and I've always felt that way. We should defer to people who are expert in this particular area as it relates to physics and meteorology and science, and when they have an opinion that is endorsed by a large percentage of their body of experts and peers, that's probably something we should be paying attention to. First and foremost in today's world is economic expansion and job creation. And I do believe that we can have economic expansion and job creation by a continued commitment toward renewable energy, new technologies, breakthroughs, and solutions. I think natural gas really is a bridge product that we need to take seriously, out of which over 5 years, based on some estimates, we could have job creation in the 500,000 range. I also believe nuclear is something that if you really want to take emissions seriously, I believe that nuclear is going to have to be part of our future as well. And then you get right back to the licensing, the environmental impact statements, so on and so forth, that are today required in order to get anything done, which makes it almost impossible to move at a rate that this country needs to move. If it really does want to take seriously the idea of a new industrial revolution, and I believe that we are poised in this country for a new industrial revolution, we need to have the right environment for growth, which we don't have today, but I think we have all of the pieces that are necessary to launch a new industrial revolution. We have it all. We have a stable marketplace, we have rule of law, we have great universities and colleges, the most innovative and entrepreneurial society the world has ever known. We just need to let them loose. And I do believe that the challenges in the marketplace, whether they're emissions or clean energy technologies, will be recognized as they are today, and we will unleash a lot of power and job-creating opportunities behind them.
I have a follow-up, actually. I'd like to connect that question to China, which is if you project China's growth forward, and particularly their carbon footprint, and if it were to get anywhere near, for example, the U.S. carbon footprint, China's going to be the big player in terms of carbon output. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also, can you talk about the challenge of trying to restrain carbon or China or India's carbon footprint when there has not been a whole lot of action on the domestic front?
So you really have two parts of this. One is the top line negotiations around emissions, which really have failed for the most part. And it's largely because China and India can't come up with an approach that would speak to believability in terms of how they quantify their underlying, how they quantify for emissions. And they're on a different page than the United States is. And all the while we've had economic problems in this country where our focus today is jobs and economic expansion. And I think any discussion of climate has taken a back seat, realistically. The bottom line is that these countries are moving forward, even without the top line talks, toward creating and innovating the solutions of tomorrow. So are they working on carbon capture sequestration? Of course they are. Are they working on nuclear plants, and dozens of them that they are permitting and siting throughout the country? Of course they are. Are they leading the world effectively in terms of photovoltaics and wind projects? They are. But they're also very realistic about the affordability of these projects and how long it's going to take before they're economically viable. I heard one person mention a conversation they had with an official in China where they basically said, we're making a lot of these things and we're selling them to the West. We're going to wait until such time as they're affordable. And once they're affordable, we'll deploy them in the marketplace. So they're very interested in moving at a pace that allows them to clean up their act, so to speak. If anyone has lived in Beijing, as I have, it's the most polluted city in the world. I mean, you take Beijing, you take Delhi, the most polluted cities in the world. They want to have world-class cities in China. They want to have world-class cities in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou. In order to do that, you've got to clean up the air. They understand that, and they've got a lot of work ahead of them. So they are doing it first and foremost for economic viability purposes. They of course want to do what's right in terms of making their contribution to cleaning up their act internationally, but they also want to do it to position some of their cities so that they are internationally recognized destinations. And that's a huge motivator for them right now.
Jeff.
Thank you.
It seems you've mostly cast China as a partner who is committed to cooperating and working with the United States. But on military issues, how do you read or interpret recent Chinese efforts like deploying a new aircraft carrier, ship-to-ship missiles, and if you were president, how would you deal with those recent developments and still maintain our commitments to our Asian allies?
Let's start with our Asian allies first and foremost. Our friends and allies have to know that they're friends and allies and have to be treated as such. And our friends and allies in the Asia-Pacific region need to be reminded of that. They're very concerned about the rise of China. They're concerned about defense spending. They're concerned about the lack of transparency. They're concerned about new weapons programs that are in the works. So if you look at China's defense budget, probably $90 billion roughly, although it's hard to get an estimate on what they spend because they don't release the numbers and it lacks fundamental transparency. As compared to ours, $640 billion. Their efforts have been focused primarily on blue water capabilities. They want to be able to deploy. And they want to be able to deploy beyond the traditional first island chain, which has been their sphere of influence, if you will. They've also invested in missile technology. So you have a combination of that focused spending and attention to blue water capabilities, submarines, and their missile program, and that really has been the centerpiece of their focus. Now, as we go forward, why did I mention military-to-military talks early on? We haven't had military-to-military talks. What do you get out of military-to-military talks? You get an ability to understand what they're spending on, why they're spending it on. And I believe a lot of the concern about the rise of China's military is a result of the fundamental lack of transparency. It's a fundamental lack of our ability and other nations' ability to penetrate what traditionally has been a very impenetrable aspect of the party in China. So ramping up our military-to-military engagement, I mean, Admiral Mullen was just over there a couple of weeks ago. We need an all-out effort in terms of military-to-military exchanges, growing our level of confidence in where their dollars are going, why they're going there, and allowing them to better understand what our presence in the region means. I mean, our presence in the region from Theodore Roosevelt right on through has been to keep the sea lanes open for the free flow of trade and commerce, from which everyone has benefited. So the Seventh Fleet sails around, and we've made a significant contribution to the economic stability and growth of the Asia-Pacific region. But I think one of our primary objectives as the United States needs to be to better understand China's military and defense priorities, why they're spending the way they do, and what we can do through dialogue to better understand that overall direction, and what we need to build in order to better understand that and counter it. There is concern not only here in the United States about where their military spending is going or might be going, but there's concern throughout the Southeast Asia region as well. There's concern in the subcontinent. There's concern all around China's periphery about what this might mean later on. Now, does this in turn provide some very legitimate opportunities for the United States to engage diplomatically with the countries of ASEAN? I think it provides a huge advantage for us. Does it provide an advantage with India, for example, to engage in kind of a new stepped-up relationship that goes maybe beyond economics? I think it provides an opening there as well. So you have to say, A, we want to better understand China's intentions, and that's going to come through military-to-military exchanges and dialogue, which we haven't had. But two, let's not lose the opportunities that we have in the region to strengthen and even develop new relationships with those who are very concerned about the rise of China and what that might mean. You mentioned an aircraft carrier. They have an old Ukraine carrier that's docked in Dalian. I've seen it. It's an old ski ramp front, and you got to remember, to be able to deploy an aircraft carrier, this is a pretty tough thing to do. You've got to be able to have arrested landings for your airplanes. I'm not sure, well, I kind of know where China is on that front, but they've got some distance to go. You've got to be able to deploy it with a larger carrier battle group. which is a very difficult, logistically, very expensive undertaking. You've got to have more than just one carrier if you're going to have a carrier battle group, one that's being, that's in port, and one that's being repaired, one that's deployed. So, this is something that I know China's looking at longer term. That is their own blue water capability. They've got a ways to go, and in the meanwhile, we've got a lot to learn and a lot of confidence to build military to military.
Why don't we go in the back, right on the aisle, oh, right behind you there. No. All right, we'll go there.
Recently, I was in China, and I was impressed with a statistic that I heard, and that was that there are something like 25 million Chinese students who are studying English. And contrary to that, in the United States, there are something like 25,000 U.S. students who are studying Chinese. That's a huge imbalance, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Would you like the answer in Chinese or English? It's interesting to note that the largest English-speaking nation today, or soon to be, is China. They have 120,000 students here in the United States. They've just surpassed India to take the #1 spot for students studying here in the United States. You go out to their colleges and universities, as I have. I used to go out and speak to student groups in auditoriums like this till the government decided that my messaging might have been a little bit too subversive, I guess. And I always found that they were keenly interested in English, in our political system, in our economic system, in trying to figure out what makes America so unique. And in order to crack that code, they had to master English. So you found a lot of students who were very, very interested in learning English. And then you go below universities and colleges to high schools and even middle schools, and there's great interest in learning English. And I think that's going to be a huge advantage for China longer term. I remember the day when I first lived in Asia back in the late 70s and visited China back in the early 80s for the first time. You couldn't find anybody who spoke English. And you go into the foreign ministry today, in the old days you didn't find anybody in the foreign ministry who spoke English, at least would use it in meetings. And today they're extremely conversant, very well schooled, very well prepared. I think we need to be similarly well prepared on our side, recognizing that the 21st century will see the United States and China on the world stage, that our interactions economically and diplomatically and militarily in large part are going to be between these two countries, and that we need to prepare for that eventuality. As governor of the state of Utah, we started a Mandarin language program. Really became one of the first in the country. And we produced, I know at one level, you can check the statistics, we had more students learning in the public schools, learning Mandarin Chinese than any state in America. And we started small, and we built it out, and I learned a very, very interesting thing. Parents would take their kids to sign up for these Chinese classes in elementary school, middle school, high school, because they knew what the 21st century holds for their kids. And they'd line up outside the class to get their kids enrolled because they knew their future. And their future would likely somehow include the languages of the 21st century. Now, I grew up and studied, a little Spanish and a little German. And I know in most schools it's French and German and Spanish. Today, gladly, you've got more in the way of offerings. But I think we need to be serious in this country about 21st century language learning, and how we can allow our young kids in public schools to begin that process of learning a strategically important 21st century language. I watched these kids in Utah. They'd come into the governor's office from the rural parts of the state, and they'd want to play Let's Stump the Governor in Chinese. And I thought, this is interesting. They come from the rural areas, their dad probably a farmer, and they are learning Chinese. And what it does is it opens their minds to culture. It opens their minds to another part of our world on the other side of the Pacific. It gets them thinking differently. And I think that thought process, what it does to young kids, is it, whether they realize it or not, is it begins to prepare them for the 21st century. And it begins to prepare us for the competitive challenges of the 21st century. And I think that it's a very important tool that we're just beginning to understand in our school system, and one that I think we can do a whole lot more with.
Well, we have run out of time. The governor has to move on, but this does lead to the public schooling question, leads naturally to Joel Klein, who'll be here on Thursday at noon. Your prerogative now is that you get to ask the first question of Joel Klein about his experience as Chancellor of the New York City Public Schools.
One of the things that is needed most in our educational system is more choice. I learned that as governor. Every student walks into the classroom with a different temperament, a different approach to learning, and we don't offer enough in the way of opportunities for our young kids. Specialized training, charter schools, greater school choice. And I would like to ask the chancellor, former chancellor, whether or not school choice should be driven at the local level of government, by school boards, by governors, or whether there's a role for the federal government to play. And if there is a role for the federal government to play in the area of choice, what exactly is it?
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for visiting Dartmouth and sharing your time.
Thank you all very much.